Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us again in this session. We're together here, myself, Dr. Joyce Nabende, Dr. Agnes Karaga, the three ladies on the COAST project, which is a project supported by the Canadian government through the International IDRC, International Research and Development Center. The project is about use of AI in COVID and support for COVID. But a big component of the project is making sure that we have equitable AI, equitable access to digital care. I know that this is something that has come up in the morning sessions, and looking forward to hearing from Dr. Ahmed, who was with us this morning on this topic. I'll let my other colleagues introduce themselves because I'm sure they'll do it better than me, but I'm Rosalind Ratanchi, I'm the director of the Academy for Health Innovation and one of the co-investigators on this COAST project. I'm handing over to Joyce.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Joyce Nakatumba Nabende. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Computer Science and also lead of the radio workstream mining project on the COAST project.
Hi, everyone. I'm Agnes Cheraga. I'm the head of statistics and data management at the Infectious Diseases Institute and an investigator as well on the COAST project, and leading a work stream that's looking at data modeling to inform COVID management in Uganda. So I'll go straight to the slides. Just a minute. Yes. All right. Yes, I'll go straight to the slides. Like Rose has mentioned correctly, we are going to talk more about bias in AI and machine learning, and then later on dive into gender bias in the same, and then talk about some strategies for controlling for bias and when you're dealing with AI projects. Okay, just a second. All right. Okay, let me just minimize this. Sorry about that. The video. All right, so I will not have to introduce AI because we've certainly had a lot about it since morning, but just to know that we are all surrounded by big data analytics and how it affects our day-to-day life. And we are seeing a lot of aggregation of different data sets across the internet and the Internet of Things and all the devices that we use, of course, in a way or another, leveraging the advances in AI. We've seen computers take over health decisions ranging from treatment, hiring, eligibility for loans and credit. So definitely where AI is living with us and we are living with AI. So the increased resilience on AI is fueling rapid automation of jobs. And in fact, this projected about 2025, which is very close, we'll see a lot of human jobs replaced by AI. But what is important to note is that most of these algorithms, most of the AI is supported by several algorithms, and the algorithms may give the illusion of being unbiased because they are written by humans and definitely trained on socially available generated data. And in a way, they encode and amplify human biases as they are being developed. We're having a technical thing here, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. And so this, I love this slide because it just shows exactly what happens in AI and machine learning. You have this set of observations or persons or individuals or data sets that you have at hand, and what criteria you use to select that one person who will represent the other is of great importance. As you can see, there are several diversities in the population down there, but it is in that process of selecting one representative that will be represent all the others that is very critical, because if that is done in an haphazard way or in a biased manner, you then develop algorithms that that definitely do not represent all the other participants. And this slide exactly shows what happens behind algorithm building. There's an image, there's a data set, there's a data point, but how the computer interprets or the robot interprets that image in a way can also lead to biases. And sometimes, and we'll see in the future, we'll see in the coming slides how the role for representation in gender when developing or showcasing different algorithms becomes critical, because it does affect the interpretation of the results that come from these algorithms. So there are several examples of bias in AI. We've seen facial recognition systems that perform better for different skin tones. We've seen certain images being associated with certain stereotypes. If it's a female, you'll see that the other suggestive websites show kitchens or shops or laundry, because that is what is associated with particular female images. And because of this, definitely there's a bias in how the results come up from these interpretations. And there is a picture here by Michelle Obama, which is very funny because the algorithm actually detected her as a young man wearing a black shirt. And when you do a lot of these algorithms, what you get is the receiver operating curve, or how well your model is actually performing. And it actually performed quite well with a confidence of almost 80%. So imagine if you develop a model that is actually giving you such confidence, but actually the image is not exactly what it is. And that creates more, it underscores the value for incorporating for minimizing bias in AI platforms. Sorry. So how is this AI introduced? I think what you need to note is that it's a process. It's incorporated in all the steps of developing of algorithms, because if there is a bias in the data that you're using to train your model, that bias is then carried over when the model is being trained, and the bias eventually gets into the output, and the bias is then carried out into this. It's a whole vicious chain of bias. And I think it's very important for any person who is going to use AI to know quite from the start the value of highlighting the potential biases that they might run into when they are developing these algorithms, because they then eventually turn to the real world. If we see these models being built with bias from the start, that bias is reflected in the data that is collected. That bias is then exposed by the algorithm that you do create, and is then acted upon by the different output. It might be a business, it might be a health-related algorithm, it might be anything predictive medicine. So all those biases then get incorporated at that stage and then translated back to the real world setting. So those are the 4 stages of AI, and very, very, very important for us to really be critical at each stage, because that vicious cycle of bias then affects our day-to-day life. So we know that sometimes it's not our fault. The data that you actually have access to might be biased. And we all know how hard it is to get access to data, and access to clean data or unbiased data becomes even more harder, because you have to do lots of mining to make sure that you're removing that bias. But sometimes that's exactly what is available. And because the data is not clearly understood, it then gets into the lack of diversity in how you make your conclusions, and it definitely feeds back into some of the conclusions we're seeing in our day-to-day life. Yes. All right, so how do we avoid this bias? There are several steps. One, and which is the fundamental, is review the algorithms that you are actually going to use when you are developing these outputs. Because the algorithms, like we've said, do perpetuate the bias. There's been several considerations about the way you can mitigate bias during AI by developing inbuilt bias detection algorithms in your data sets. This is becoming quite common. And when you're also developing these algorithms, it's very important to avoid the societal bias that comes with some of the assumptions you're making during the development of these models. And if you disassociate yourself from these biases, then it becomes much easier to create unbiased algorithms. And I think it's also important to get domain experts when you're developing a particular model or an algorithm or a product. Please kindly work with experts. I like the way they call them domain experts in the AI field. They're actually experts in certain technical areas. Work with them, discuss, find out what can I do to control, how can I represent this particular subgroup much better, how do I incorporate unbiased assumptions in this. And then obviously we know that as much as we're depending on the computer, there are now systems that should require human in the loop decision making. Do not leave the actual algorithm to the computer because it will certainly be biased. And then as ethical bodies that are working around research around AI and big tech companies, it's now the onus of these to develop regulations that will definitely monitor and be very, very vigilant in identifying potential biases when they are reviewing proposals or grant applications that are incorporating AI. And then try as much as possible to have diversity in the issues of science and technology and the education pipeline when you are developing these models. And I'll end with these slides in terms of explainability and accountability of the models that we use. We need to explain all the assumptions behind any AI algorithm. It's very, very important to explain your steps, explain the model, make sure that each assumption you put in there is correctly labeled so that a person has the privilege to judge your results or the algorithm correctly based on your assumptions. And then characterize the strengths and weaknesses of the products that will then help in predicting what you're going to get. And lastly, there is need for transparency in the data used for training and validation of these algorithms and machine learning projects, because if you're using different data sets for training and validation, in a way, sometimes this does not, it may cause a problem at some point. So I think that as we conclude this particular session, we need to know that minimizing bias is going to be very, very critical if AI is to reach its potential and increase people's trust in the systems that will be impacting their lives and livelihoods. So I think I'll end here and then I'll ask Joyce to take us through some use cases of where we've seen actually AI and we've seen biases in AI, gender bias particular in AI supported projects.
Thank you, Agnes. Yeah, so I will continue and then I think we'll take the questions at the end. Yeah, so I am going to speak about gender bias specifically in AI. So what's gender bias? So bias in AI is really wide and there's several examples of bias, which we are not going to go into, but we're going to focus really on gender bias and see what are the examples of gender bias that we've encountered. And then since this is a workshop, we're going to open it up for discussion at the end, such that we can brainstorm about this, especially in the health domain. So gender bias is really one of the most prevalent biases. Nice. Yeah, so just a minute. Sorry, give me a minute. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so gender bias is defined in particular context. So it's different in particular context. And so when you're trying to talk about gender bias, you need to think about the context in which it's being applied. So for example, if you're looking at it in an occupation, that's very different. For example, if you're looking at it in a completely different domain. So as Agnes has said, that usually the bias comes from us, ourselves as human beings. So there's already gender bias in our societies. And because we pick up the data that we are going to use to train our AI models from the societies that we are living in, this will translate the bias into the AI training data. And so that way we have the social biases and stereotypes, and they end up finding their way into AI systems. And if we look at our AI training data, and it has the stereotypical concepts of gender, the resulting application of the technology will just enhance the bias that's already existing. Because of course, AI systems are relying on algorithms that are learning from real world data that's made by humans. So what are the examples of gender bias that we see? So for the people who come from Uganda, I think this example is typical. We all know who I think is Mr. Andrew Chitaka, and we also know who Miss Jennifer Mosisi is, right? So all of these are former executive directors of Kampala Capital City Authority. So if you put them in Google search, it's surprising the kind of results that you'll be able to get out, right? So if you look at Andrew, who's a male, the result will come out with a boss. They'll come up with, you know, strong headlines of the director has been appointed, or Engineer Chitaka has been appointed as a director. So the search results for him are very different from the search results of Jennifer. Jennifer is a female. So what will come out of Google? There'll be pictures saying about family, about house, about fashion. There's nothing to say that she was also a director, that she did great improvements in the city of Kampala, yet we know she did a lot of work, right? And so this is inherent even in the search algorithms that we see, that they will be able to come out and put more stereotypes around the female of the person that you're searching for, because females are more associated with home caring, with building, with dressing up, with fashion, which sometimes is not usually the case. But with males, it's about authority, it's about the boss. So that's one very simple example of bias. But more importantly, if you look at the Google Translate, and I know many of us, when you go to a foreign country and you don't understand the language, the first thing you'll do is, I need to translate. You know, I need to go to Google Translate to get the translation of this language that I don't understand. So this is a typical example of a translation system that's translating from English to Swahili. And so the statement that is put into the search engine is, he is a hospital nurse. So you get a very good Kiswahili translation over there. Now, supposing I got that translation and I wanted to know what the English translation was, and then I put it in my search engine, the result I get is, she is a hospital nurse. So I hope that we are seeing the problem here. It's the same sentence. It was he from English, it got to Swahili. I took it back from Swahili to English automatically, because there's a nurse associated with it. I think Agnes mentioned this. It automatically puts the gender stereotype as she. And so this comes in with languages that don't have proper pronouns for their genders, and we are getting such problems here. And if I had, for example, put, maybe to solve this problem, I could have put, he is a male hospital nurse, for example, or she is a female hospital nurse. However, if this was the translation that he is a doctor, definitely from Swahili back to English, it would be, he is a doctor, right? Because according to the gender stereotypes, they associate males to be doctors and females to be nurses, which is not always the case. So really what we want to show from this slide, and I hope that everyone appreciates, that AI reinforces the gendered roles and occupations that are already existing. So it just amplifies them. For example, if we look at machines that are taught by photo-based image recognition software, they also quickly learn gender bias. And in a recent study at the University of Virginia, it showed that images that depict activities just such as cooking, shopping, washing were more linked to women, while images of shooting, coaching, football coaching, I think, are more linked to men. And the result for that was that the data sets, when they were tested, they discovered that the AI not only reflected that unconscious stereotype of the creators, but it just amplified them. So it's very important when you're building AI models to look at the data. Data is very, very important, because if you're pushing data that says that we want to train a model that's able to recognize a photo and say, is this photo for males or is this photo for females? And the only photos you throw in for males are for photos who are, males who are coaching football clubs, or males who are, leading presidents, for example. And if by any chance we got a female president and threw in that photo, definitely it would not associate, your algorithm wouldn't perform very well. females, their photos should really be about cooking, cleaning, washing, which is not the case. Okay, another example, I think this is similar to the NLP system for translation. So Princeton University found that AI's word associations are usually called word embeddings. They reinforce stereotypes on everything from what the internet searches. And this was something that they were using for hiring. So for example, they found gender stereotypes in word choices, like nurse, for example, was associated with males, and with females. Nurturing was associated with women, while doctor was more associated with male. And if you're using this AI system as a system to help you make decisions for recruiting, definitely you will not accept nurse candidates who are male, for example, or that model will be more inclined to accept the nurse candidates that are female at a much higher rate. And if I came as a female and I want to be accepted as a doctor, the model will probably don't give a good decision, or its confidence will be very low, right? Because it's trained to accept more doctors who are males. And then, yeah, and part C is the same as what we just showed for the machine translation services that found that AI systems assumed nurse, nanny, teacher to be women, while doctors to be males. And so that's usually the problem. And maybe it might think like it's such a small thing, but if for example, as a policymaker, you're going to use this data for making decisions, and then you come in and the data is biased towards male, that means that even the data set is not representative enough, and you're going to make decisions that might inherently affect the females because their voices are probably not heard or their data is not captured if you're relying on AI for making decisions. So one of the projects that we lead on that we do on the COST project is the radio mining project. And the radio mining project is important to us because here we get to understand the voices of the offline communities. And these are the communities that probably don't have access to the internet. They will not have smartphones, for example, to go and tweet. But they will listen to radio because radio is free, it's more available, and more important, it's in their local languages. And so one of the projects that we're doing is, or one of the things that we're doing on this project is to build speech recognition systems that automatically mine radio data to be able to understand the sentiments of people and the views of people around COVID-19, because it's important for us to analyze this and hoping that these views and ideas can really feed into the public policy for decision making, for example, by the Ministry of Health. But the good thing is also that it's subject agnostic. It can feed to any other domain around because that's how radio is. And so we all know that at a higher level that women are, underrepresented in radio data. Men and women, of course, are looking at media and digital technologies. They engage with media very differently. And that's true with phone usage, for example, but we're not going to go deeper into the use of ICTs, etc., but it's just to show that radio is one of these ICT and digital technologies out there where you still see a divide between the males and the females. And so one of the things that we wanted to analyze is the gendered analysis of media access and use. And so as a first dive into the data is a lot because we get from several radio stations, and we have to have a pipeline. We get the data, get the usable hours of the data. I will not go into details here, but from the first preliminary analysis of the data, we're able to see that if you look at generally all the usable data, the phone calls that come in, for example, or even the people who hold the discussions on radio, we found that when we did analysis of the data for May 2021, that 33%, only 33% were female. Whereas the rest of the discussions and the phone-ins and everything else that was going on in radio was being led by male at 67%. If you also look at, for example, the digital divide in the mobile phone ownership, again, this is a study that was done where they tried to analyze the usage and the ownership of phones across different countries, and Uganda is one of the countries that we see there. We definitely see that males, take a more, dominant with mobile phone ownership. And the reason why this slide is important as well is because when we're looking at radio data, one of the things that we focus on is the phonemes, the people phoning in maybe to a talk show or phoning in to report a problem happening in their area. And so phone ownership is important, because if women do not have access to phones, then we don't expect them to call that much. So that means that their ideas or their views would probably be neglected because we cannot hear them on radio as we do our analysis. So we again went ahead to just try and look at what do people say, what are the discussions that people say. Generally, looking at both males and females, they were all encouraging people. So when we did the use case for May 2021, we wanted to understand what are the discussions on radio around COVID-19 vaccinations, because vaccination is now a big thing here in Uganda. And so we realized that both females and males were encouraging people to get vaccinated and to avoid the false rumors about vaccinations in the different discussions that were going on. Then females in particular, the things that they cared about were, for example, they said the distances to the vaccination centers are too long. So maybe it's very difficult for them to walk there. You never know, maybe they have to carry their babies along with them as they go to be vaccinated. So they care about that. They want the vaccines to be brought closer to them. But also they wanted to, be assured that people in a certain location are not really negligent about the COVID-19 vaccination. Whereas the males, again, they also have different views around COVID-19. For example, saying people are violating COVID-19 SOPs in different places, but also they wanted more around the training, giving training to people, giving briefing to people, around vaccinations themselves. So this is just a very small analysis of the data, and I'm not saying that this is everything that is going on or everything that people are saying on radio, but we just try to understand and see, how is it different? Are even males talking on radio and females talking on radio? And we were able to come up with some sort of analysis of the data that we think we can move ahead and analyze much further. Yeah, so I think I will stop there around gender bias. And there are many ways in which all these can be resolved that Agnes, of course, already talked about, how to avoid bias in AI models and also gender bias in AI models. I think maybe we can stop here for now and first take questions in the chat or any questions before we can move on to the next part of the session.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one thing, which is actually there is a slight what's the word? A slight flip in Uganda in terms of, well, actually globally, in terms of health-seeking behavior. So globally, women are better at seeking healthcare than men. So if you can just, can you just let me share a sec? So if we look at, this is our digital data set that we have for one of our projects. And we, I just want to show you the kind of the demographics here. So Tama was a pilot for this project. And in the pilot, we actually recruited people into the study at 50% male and 50% female. But when we actually rolled out the project, which is this Call for Life RCT and Call for Life Light, the two different areas, you can see that 70% of the people enrolling in the project, and this is a digital health project, were female. Now, this is because this is just directly related to the fact that more women are engaged in HIV care. There's slightly more women have HIV than men, but also more women come forward to seek care and seek care regularly than men do. So that's a kind of flip side on what we've been talking about, but it's something that we also have to take into account. And as our colleagues in Uganda are aware, actually in the HIV world, there has been like a big push in the last 12 months to really try and engage men in care. There's been, headlines about where are all the HIV positive men? Why aren't our men coming forward? So we do have to not just assume that the bias will always be in the way that we are used to it being. In some data sets, we may have a bias in the other direction. And, if we are to think about a global perspective at the moment, which is not where we are in Uganda, but from a global perspective, increasing numbers of young people are rejecting traditional binary gender roles. And, if we are to engage with young people in the future, I'm sure that this will also happen in Uganda, is that we are also going to have to think about, as we're becoming old ladies and gentlemen, and we're not keeping up with the youngsters, they are increasingly rejecting binary male and female genders, and that's something that we have to think about for the future. Sorry, Joyce, thank you. Sorry, we can go back to your slides now. I just wanted to add that bit.
Yeah, thanks, Agnes. I think that was, sorry, Rose.
Okay.
Yeah, that was it about the slides. And thanks, I see the activity in the chat. Thanks a lot, Mohad, for all the papers that you're sharing, are about gender bias and the data sheets as well. Yes, data sheets are something that we are also advocating for, especially.
Could you maybe give us maybe Mohammed could give us some information on what the data sheets are?
Yeah, just feel free.
Hi, thank you very much for a really interesting and insightful talk, Agnes and Joyce. That was wonderful to hear. So data sheets comes out of the process of trying to understand what do we codify in our data, in the simple act of collecting it and preparing it and curating it for building machine learning models. And it's an attempt to formally try to list out, these are the actions that I took in my data. This is what it contains. These are the properties of the data, and these are the biases that I've observed in the data. And the reason for that is that it's very difficult to be able to say very general things, or rather very specific things about very large data sets. Yeah, and very large data sets on the internet are biased by virtue of where they come from. Often this data is crawled on the internet, and the people that are on the internet producing data tend to be young people from a wealthier part of the world. And on top of that, you have data which is then curated by another group of people which fits similar profiles. And what you then end up having is biases which are built into the data, which then propagate onto the algorithms that we build on top of the data, which then propagate onto the decisions we make on top of those data sets. So those two papers that I linked, the data sheets for data sets and the stochastic parrots paper, are very much linked, because they talk about the tragedies, and literally the tragedies that fall out of not curating our data and spending enough time trying to understand what the properties of our data sets are. And it's a very important thing. It's also not something that is widely appreciated and accredited.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's really brilliant, and thanks for the paper as well for teammates. I think that has been really making rounds, and people are beginning to get back to talk about the data, because yes, you can have very fancy models and everything is working very well, but if the data that you're using to train those fancy models is not well curated, then that would be a problem. So thanks for the resources as well. Yeah.
Dr. Agnes, do you want to talk about the question? You've answered it in the chat, but others might be interested.
You're muted, Rosalind.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So
Yes, I'd answered that in the chat. I think it was from Winnie. There is not direct, it's not really that direct for you to say that, yeah, it does occur, but I'm now speaking statistically, by the way. It's not a direct relationship, but just to know that it is certainly, it is something that we need to be aware of. It might not be that direct, like I rightly said. There could be other in statistical modeling, or again, even AI, there could be other features, or there could be other confounders that do then lead to that selective bias of certain attributes that we see in the model. So it's not a really direct relationship between the two, but just to know that we need to be very mindful of it from the start, and with whatever algorithm, and you just have that at the back of your mind. If I'm picking a sample of school-going children, you need to know how representative that group is from a child who's left at home. And if you're developing they're predicting something about children's growth, you need to know that in the group that I'm using, there could be a selected group that I've not addressed because of the different biases in there, the ethics of not being able to arrive or include certain populations. So it does occur, but it's not very direct. There are other confounders that do affect this relationship, in summary.
So Ross, I think yes, Matt, did you want to say something? Do you have another question for us?
No, I wanted to add a little bit to Agnes's point that it's not the case that we have to live with bias in data. Data can be de-biased. Fundamentally, if we sort of go to the statistics of it, we're talking about some sort of label or class imbalance. And if we care to understand what it is that we're interested in, then we should actively be de-biasing our data sets. So it's not enough to just say, this is what my data set looks like, and I went with it.
So Rose.
Yeah, thanks. So what we wanted to do was, while we have this group here, we've been doing quite a lot of work today, and our presenters have been doing quite a lot of work, including Ahmed. But what we wanted to do was also to, give you guys a little bit of work, or those of us who are also joining. We have something called a Jamboard. I don't know if people have used a Jamboard before, but if you click on the link, I think Joyce will just put the link into the chat now. If you click on the link, we have an interactive Jamboard that we would like us to think about putting in. So if we go across to the Jamboard, I'll just bring it up on my screen here. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so there's 3 questions. So you can go through yourselves, but we'll just talk the questions through. What you do is you can do this anonymously, or you can edit. I'm just thinking, Joyce, on my version, it says I've only got view only. So I don't know if everybody else has the same. That's okay. So you might have to refresh. And then once you're on, I think you can see my screen. Am I sharing my screen on Zoom? Can everybody see on Zoom the Jamboard? Sorry, let me just do that again. Okay, so on here, you can get a sticky note. You can choose the color of your sticky note, and you can write an answer to the question. So the first question is, we've already talked about this a little bit, but we are only 3 or 4 people here that have been talking about this. We want to get your opinions and other people's opinions on how AI can negatively affect gender equality and women in particular. So what are the possible negative effects of AI? The next question is, how can we overcome these built-in biases? So we've talked about this a little bit, but you guys also might have ideas of how we can do that we haven't discussed. What can we do with these data sets? How, as Ahmed is saying, do we, de-bias these data sets? And then what can we do to create robust and gender inclusive AI policies? So if we go back to the first one, I think you can log in as yourself. I think if you see at the top, Joyce is logged in as herself, but all of us are anonymous animals. So anonymous hippo, anonymous fox, anonymous chameleon, and anonymous bird, crow. You won't, please don't feel embarrassed or concerned that there's lots of clever AI people in the call. But we only have 5 of us joined, but we have a few more people in the workshop. So I think if others, we have 16 people in the workshop, but only 5 of us joined the Jamboard. So can those of us who haven't joined the Jamboard go over? You just click on the link in the chat. We only have 4 people. Yeah, so there's a link in the chat. Oh, we have a few more. So I'm going to get my sticky note, and the question is, in what way can negatively affect it? So I'm just thinking in terms of the Call for Life project. So if women do not have access to a mobile phone, then they will not be able to use the system. Therefore, when we use the data, okay, so you can make your thing different sizes. So we've got the pipeline of women participating in AI is small, leading to inequality and AI specialists. So I hope we're redressing that balance. I'm just looking around the room. We're 4 ladies, and Dr. Dowdy Jingo is our one lone male in the room. So hopefully we're doing our little bit in here. We need another man to come in and make our gender a bit more stable. So data bias leads to bias in the problems we address. For example, lack of healthcare for women, lack of generic data means precision medicine ignores their bodies and needs. And there's a reference there to a paper about this. So gender discrimination, for example, in job applications. Yes, so some companies are using AI to do job applications at the moment, and they may be discriminating on the basis of names, they may be discriminating on the basis of gender. That's a big concern. If women do not have access to mobile phones, then they will not be able to use mobile phone-based systems. Therefore, when we use the data for an algorithm, it may not take into account something that's particularly female biased. So pregnancy-related symptoms may be reduced. So I'm pleased to see that Max Moha Ahmed. Max, I don't know whether I should be calling you Max, Mohammed, or Ahmed. You're going to have to tell me.
It's Mohammed.
You're going to have to tell me which one is right. And Atwine,
Mohammed, that spelling
he's with us. So Atwine, good to see you there. Good to see you there as well. Okay, so that's great. So on to the next one. So the question is, well, so what do we do about this? So how can we make our data sets unbiased? What are the actual practical things? So we talked about data sheets, but what other things, practically can we think about doing? What other creative solutions may there be, around this? Go to the up, and you can, if you go to the up screen, you just move the arrow across. Where are all the little pictures of we've got some new animals, bats and things. Okay, so so one comment is I think we need to rethink the data process if we intend to use the data for AI. Most data we've collected is just to be kept without any serious thought put into its use later. Yeah, so we, for example, so Agnes and I, when we're writing a research protocol, would write a research protocol which would look at particular sub-analyses of gender, but we would let the data probably guide us onto what that sub-analysis looked like. But if we wanted to use the data set for AI, then we may want to specifically recruit a balanced data set or specifically curate it. So involving men in health-seeking behavior and in gender-based discussions. Yes, that is a very good point. We cannot have a female-based, gender-based discussion. We have to have balance between the few. That is a very good. Yeah, Dowdy is here. I promise. He's not saying a lot, but you know, but he is with us. Well, I was trying to show you Dowdy, but yeah. But he hasn't got a computer open in front of him, so he's not using stickies. And then there is a comment here using large data sets. Yeah, I mean, so obviously the larger the data set, the more different people we have in the data sets. We've got here, be deliberate in data extracting processes to ensure balanced representation. Also, some statistical weighting methods can be used to represent the unrepresented gender. Absolutely, but I think we also, I mean, it's not just, what we haven't talked about is the nuances of this as well, right? There are other things that we need to account for, like age and gender. So it might be that we end up with all young males and all old ladies, or all young ladies and all old men, you know, depending on who has the time. So it is a bit more nuanced than just gender. There are other things. It might be that we get single women and married men, right? It might be that we get, you know, even if you have a data set of 20 to 25-year-olds, we might have men in university and girls who are married, or men without children and girls with children. You know, there's it's not just about, you know, about the black and white. So there's some other great ideas here. Keep the human aspect at different points to act as checks and balances. I think that that's really important. Make the data sets more diverse in terms of gender, age, and social data. Yeah, that's what we're just talking about. Give appropriate time at the data leveling the process of creating AI. So I think that this is something that we are advocating for. And when we were putting together this workshop, what we were actually talking about is this workshop really needs to be about the data. This workshop is not about the AI or the algorithms or whatever. It's making sure that the data, you know, the data is in a good space. Present evaluations on edge cases and minority classes. So, you know, I think we haven't talked about language here, but in a country with, you know, over 20 different languages, you know, we may end up with all the women speaking English in Uganda and only, you know, only the men speaking a variety of different languages, because rural men tend to be the ones with telephones or internet and rural women don't seem to have them. So we've got lots of challenges ahead of us, and we need to think about all of these things. It's like they always say about modeling, like junk in, junk out, right? You know, if you don't have you know, the right things. So there's a couple more. Make the data sets more diverse, develop official guidelines and checklists. So again, around the data sets. Okay, that's great. So in the last few minutes, now we're going to, that last question takes us, which is about guidelines and checklists, now takes us to robust and gender inclusive AI policies. So I have a question here that's come up a lot today about policies and about regulations. I feel that as researchers, we tend to think that regulations and policies are not our problem, and that some magical person who has more knowledge than us Exactly, and there's some magical person who has more knowledge than us is going to write the law. The one thing that Kenneth Mohangi, who talked in the Drones Project, taught me is the people that write the law are just like us. They're no special, they have no superpowers. And actually, if they don't have the knowledge that we do, it is our responsibility to make sure that we are there in the process. So I think we, as researchers, we have a responsibility to get involved in regulatory issues. But in this particular area, more than anything else, when we're on the cutting edge in technology and innovations, really much more, we have to be involved. So guys online, I would be grateful for your comments. How do we do this? How do we get involved in the conversation? How do we make sure that robust and gender inclusive, and not just gender inclusive, but vulnerable populations, young people, pregnant women, children, prisoners, you know, all the groups that are, you know, people, I don't know, people of tribes that have traditionally not had a voice because of their geography or because of their social setup. So what are your ideas? How do we push this conversation on? What do we do to push the agenda forward? Okay, so design element. Well, designing an AI needs to be aware of the risks, thus identify and build up appropriate checks and corrections. I think that might be for the thing before. Can we write simple policies for the projects we're working on and combine them later? So that's absolutely something that we're trying to do within Post. It's difficult because, you know, when you've got lots of things to write, like papers and grants and everything else, that tends to get pushed to the bottom of the pile, but it is very important. Regulation always lags innovation. We need to engage actively, and as researchers, we need to engage. Absolutely. And so what do we do? I mean, I think our steering committee that we've set up for the coast, I think is starting to get traction. So steering committees with high level government officials helps because it's drawing it to their attention. I think taking part, I think Agnes, you're doing it. So taking part in working groups set up by government is important. If they've actually got those working groups. I mean, if they don't have them, it's a different thing, but we can't just say, oh, that's not our job. Actually, if somebody asks you to take part, we kind of need to, otherwise we don't have a right to complain about the policies. Any other suggestions about how we can do this better? I mean, things like, I guess, the things like the conference, things like getting people to come to meetings. Anybody on the group got any other suggestions in this area? How do we do this? Dowdy, you've been very quiet.
You know, I'm a female dominated.
It's feeling bad.
I mean, it's at least speaking for men again in the room, and it may not be something direct that we do at a technical level in terms of algorithms or whatever, but it's I think we just need to, it's easy for this is look at it from a gender angle, for men to think everything is fine because they are not on the short end of the stick. Often some things that are subtle are not so obvious, they may not appear on their radar in terms of what they need to pay attention to. And I think if there's any way we can help us, we may like just listen a bit more to these things. Whether we do that technically or not, I think can be quite helpful in eventually shifting the narrative and the perceptions and the assumptions around gender. So yeah, this can be maybe just having a little more literature around, a little more videos, a little more basically gender awareness material, opportunities for people to engage with this kind of thing, so that they are more tuned in when it comes up to them.
Okay,
Right.
that's great. So so really, I mean, I think this has been, you know, a great discussion. There's not a lot that we can do in an hour, but I think the more we talk about the fact that bias can exist, the more we'll start to look for bias in other areas. And I think gender bias is one thing, but I think there are many, many, many other biases in AI data, some that we haven't even thought about yet, right? So I think that we need to keep this conversation live. We need to keep pushing ourselves, stimulating ourselves, thinking about what there is. Mohammed, Max, Ahmed, I'm not quite sure which of the three, but you had shared a really amazing slide in your presentation earlier on about the papers. There was a dermatology paper, one of your slides from your presentation this morning. I think I took a screenshot of it actually somewhere. I think, or maybe you have it. It was the one with all the different papers. Yeah, this one. So this was a really, you know, this was a really interesting slide with, you know, just different papers that are talking about, you know, skin color and how, you know, if the algorithms are not really designed for different skin tones, then they're only going to be able to look at a particular, you know, subset of the population and not the entire population. So I think, you know, I think there are many, many, many issues in this area. The first thing is for us to get the message out to a wider group of people to say AI is biased, AI can be biased. The way it's constructed at the moment is really not in our favor. You know, and we need to do something about this. And then as we're keeping having conversations, you know, we need to start thinking about everything that we do and trying to minimize it in what we are doing so that we are good examples, but at the same time advocating for you know, change in this area. Sorry, you have a question.
If I can add, it's not just AI.
Sorry, my speaker's not on. Here you go.
Can you hear me? Right. So Mohammed, first of all, it's the Somali spelling of my name. So it's not just
Thank you for that.
It's not just AI, it's all sciences that depend on data for some form of decision making. So forget AI. If you, for example, look at the blood oxygenation meters that sort of fire an infrared light through your finger, I think you've seen them. Those have a much higher error rate on darker skin than lighter skin, simply because they're not calibrated for darker skin. Yeah. So anything whereby you're using a data set to make a decision, and in that case, some data set was used in order to find what value the calibration should take into consideration. Yeah. And that value didn't have very many dark skinned people involved. Yeah. So diabetes, the diabetes numbers in terms of how they're distributed between type A and type 1 and type 2. They don't take into account the race of people, genetic data. There's a massive bias in terms of the genetic data that is available simply because we don't collect enough genetic data about what are considered minority communities in the West. So any sort of data and decision format where the dependence is on data, we need to be critical on the nuances in that data, where it comes from, what it considers and what it emits, and be transparent about these nuances so that we can then go back and say, this is what is missing, this is what is included, and this is what we should, this is the error bounds that we should be considering in this setting. So to an extent, it's difficult to advocate for fairness in all data because it's not possible. It's not possible to be able to go out to every community to be able to get the right representation of it. And even when you do that, you get a bias simply in numbers. Yeah. So the next thing that we can do is be transparent. And by being transparent, we can then go back and address the weaknesses of our algorithms and the weaknesses of the methods that we build in relation to what we've collected. that's the point that I wanted to make.
Thank you so much. That's great. And I think that's you know, a really important message, you know, to take home. I think that many of the sessions today have been talking about, you know, the hope and the opportunities and the exciting things that we can do. And I think, you know, there is a lot of excitement about what we can do with machine learning and AI, but I think, you know, we have an opportunity with these new projects that are coming up. You have an opportunity with your new research unit in Nairobi with Microsoft. We have an opportunity to try and do things right the first time around. But it requires a lot of heavy thinking, and it's difficult and it's not easy, and it requires us to use our brain power and think very hard and be very, very careful about what we're doing. But I think that this is a call for all of us to, you know, keep our eyes open as we go into this new technology and not sleepwalk into it and make the same mistakes that have been made with data previously. So that's great. Thank you so much. Is there anybody that wants to raise their hand? Any more questions or comments from the floor at all? If not, it was lovely to meet you all. Mohammed, Joyce and Dowdy are part of our AI STI group, so we will be getting in touch with you when we have an inception meeting. And Dr. Elizabeth Lisa, who's on there, is going to be our project coordinator. Lisa, can you put your camera on for a sec? Maybe that's not very fair. She hasn't started work yet, so okay, leave your, there she is in the car. So she will also be in touch when she starts next week. We'll start the meetings off. But thank you so much, everyone. It was a really interesting session, lots to think about, lots to go home and process overnight as our brains work in our sleep. Favor is saying we have an opportunity at the beginning of data collection and conversation around biomedical engineering. So thanks so much, guys. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for all of your input. Mohammed, thank you for all the papers and things that you've put in the chat. And have a good evening. And we hope to see some of you back at the conference tomorrow. Thanks so much. Thanks.